Hello, everybody, and welcome to your Rouxbe live event. My name is Eric Wynkoop, and I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction, and I'm also one of your instructors in the Rouxbe courses. And in particular, today, I'd like to welcome you to my open office hours. And this is your chance to ask food and cooking related questions, and my chance to do my best to provide some guidance and some sort of an answer that'll help you out. And as we get started, I want to mention just a couple of housekeeping items. And the first is, if you'd like to participate a little more directly in today's program, you can do so by entering a question or a comment in the dialog box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And number two, you'll see some questions already populated in the queue. And if you'd like a particular question answered sooner than later, you can click on the heart-shaped icon in that particular question box and in that right-hand column, and it'll bump that up in priority. All right. Otherwise, let's go ahead and jump into today's selection of questions. And I see the first one is from Kathleen, who asks, can you share your favorite way to cook with miso? By far the usual way that I use miso is to make the typical miso soup, typical to Japanese homes, typical to the way that I grew up with a Japanese mother. And what we've been doing here for a bunch of years now. I spend my sons, and generally ours, but I'll say our son's breakfast for most of his school years now. He's now in college. And so that's it. And, I've always got some white miso, some red miso. I'll use those singularly. I will blend them from time to time. I'll occasionally pick up other styles and flavors of miso. We've got chickpea miso and other varieties at the grocery store not far from here. But otherwise, you can mix miso with things like sake and mirin, and make a paste that can go on to fish or vegetables or other things. And you can bake those or grill those items or broil those items to add a nice layer of flavor. Miso can be used to preserve egg yolks. That's an old technique. And what I've done is to get some cheesecloth. You fold that over a few times. Line it with miso, and then you get an egg yolk and place it in the center. And it's nice to put that in a container of some sort so you can cover that up with plastic wrap so the yolk doesn't dry out so much on the top side, but the miso will draw out some of the moisture. And it's an old way of preserving egg yolks in Japan. You can eat the miso, eat the yolks at that point, however you might want to enjoy those. So those are just a couple of three things that come to mind. There's certainly many more techniques if you want to take a look online at what other people are doing. Thank you. And the next question is from Mark, who says, I'm about to minimize my nonstick pan use and thinking of getting an all-clad stainless steel with a lid that's on sale today. Perfect. Do you think all-clad stainless steel is a good choice, and what are the benefits of a lid? You bet. All-clad is one of those brands that have stood the test of time. I've used all-clad off and on over the years. It works fine. No complaints about it. And it'll also last you the rest of your life. I mean, that's the nice thing with some good cookware, is that the construction is solid. It's something that will evenly disperse heat, so it's nice to use. You won't probably get tired of it or frustrated with it. And again, you can use it for the rest of your life, and then someone else can enjoy it. In terms of a lid, lids are useful in keeping in moisture and also keeping in heat. It's always nice to have a lid that fits a pan or two or three if it works out that way. Um, if you want to steam a little something, if you're starting out with a saute, dry heat, some caramelization, some browning is developed, and then you want to finish it by putting a lid on and trapping the heat, creating an oven-like environment, to finish off something. That's another way that a lid can be useful. And as you get into cooking with your new technology, Mark, I think you'll find the more subtle ways that you might use a lid as well. Thank you. All right, we have another question. This one is from Denise, who says, hello or hi. Hi, Denise. When we prepare, chop, dice raw vegetables, and then refrigerate, do they lose nutrition over a few days? For example, if we cut up carrots, celery, cucumber, lettuce for sandwiches ahead of time. The quick answer is yes, I'm reasonably certain that there's going to be some shift, in the quality from a nutrition standpoint, right, of what you're cutting up because it's being exposed to air and there's oxidation taking place. And so for those particular nutrients that are vulnerable to oxidation, there's going to be a shift in their quality. What that looks like exactly is hard to know, or even practically impossible for us to know on a day-to-day basis. I'm certain that you can find some research online, or maybe you can tap into a database for journals, maybe through your public library or your local university, and you can find some specific discussion around what kinds of shifts and how much change would take place over a specific period of time. But please know that outside of that particular information that you would read, what happens in your own kitchen will be a little bit different, and sometimes even a lot different. And there's no way for us to know exactly what's going on at that point. But I would say that there's going to be some shift, but I don't know. So you can help, mitigate some of that by shortening the time that cut food is held in order to enjoy greater quality overall, right? So not only does the nutrition shift, but so does, culinary qualities. In other words, texture and taste and flavor, aroma. These things will change as well as if food is exposed to air through oxidation, as well as other effects in the environment, from the environment. Okay, I hope that provides a little bit of perspective, Denise. Every once in a while we get these sorts of questions, and really, practically speaking, it's difficult or impossible, again, practically speaking, to know what's going on in our particular kitchen. So we just try to generally mitigate some of that change by adopting some best practices for our particular situation. Thank you. And next up, we've got a question from Elena, perhaps Ilana. And it says, I'd like to start a business where I teach people how to cook. How do you charge for teaching people to cook when food is very expensive? So I think the first thing to do is to go online and do a little bit of field work and figure out what is being charged in your locality or your region for cooking classes. And, I would reach out to the local community college, if you have one of those, or other, let's say formal institution that might offer some community classes, in this area, i.e. cooking. Get an idea of what they offer. In other words, the type of class, the type of cuisine. Take a look at the syllabus to get an idea of the complexity of the menu that's being offered. Take a look at the duration of the class and get an idea of just how much interaction the student or the client will have. So in other words, some of these classes are observation only, others are full hands-on, and others are a balance of those two ends of the spectrum. And then take a look at, if you're able to, the specific types of ingredients that are used, so you can get an idea of the expense, right, for that dish and for that menu. And then also take a look at other sources for cooking lessons in your area. And there are bound to be private folks, like yourself, who are giving this a try. And also compare prices between in-person and online lessons. Also consider your experience that you bring into the class. It's reasonable to expect that a less experienced teacher and cook in a particular discipline might charge less than someone who is more experienced in those areas. Maybe not, but something to consider. Okay. When it comes to the cost of the food itself, there are a couple of ways to do this. You can send a shopping list to your student, to your client, ahead of time, telling them to procure all of those things prior to the class. And I've seen this done for online classes, of course, as well as in-person classes. Or if it's going to be an in-person class, you can roll that expense into your price tag, and then just pass that on as a single cost to your client. In this case, you're going to have to cost out the recipes and cost out the menu. And the way we do that is taking a single recipe as an example. Take a look at the ingredients and the quantities, and you'll need to go out to wherever you buy those ingredients and write down the cost, right? The price that you pay on a pound basis or whatever the unit of measure is by which you purchase that item. So produce is usually by weight. It could be a kilo, it could be in a 100-gram unit, it could be by the pound. Meats, seafood will be priced in a similar manner. Other things, dry items like olive oil could be by volume. Other liquids could be by volume. In the case of canned items, they're going to be by that canned unit. And then further, as you go to cost it down, you look at the label and use the unit of measure that's on the label. Often it's going to be in ounces or fluid ounces or grams. Okay. And so you'll need to measure out what you would use for the lesson, right, for that recipe, and then calculate the cost of how much you use for the recipe versus the pack size. So, for example, if you bought, let's say you need 12 ounces of carrots in the recipe, and you buy a pound of carrots at $1, you'll take that dollar per pound, which is equivalent to $1 per 16 ounces. You'll take the dollar divided by 16 to get the cost for 1 ounce, and then you would multiply that by the 12 ounces in the recipe. Okay, and that's the basic procedure. Same thing if it was a canned item or a liquid item in fluid ounces. If you buy a 32 fluid ounce container of something and you're using let's say 7 fluid ounces in the recipe. You'll take the price of that 32 fluid ounce container, divide it by 32 to drop it down to a 1 fluid ounce cost, and then multiply it by the 7 fluid ounces in the recipe. Okay. And again, you'll go through each line item, each ingredient to get the cost for the quantity that's used in that recipe. Then you'll add up everything to get the recipe total. And if you have 5 recipes in your menu, then you'll do that for all 5 recipes. You'll add all those up so you have an idea of what your food cost will be for the entire menu. So we call this food cost. And you want to do that on a recipe basis, which also gives you the ability to break it down to a per portion food cost. And then you could also, add up all of the food costs for the different recipes that you use to come up with a menu cost for a cooking class or cooking lesson that you might offer. And then you want to use that as a one data point along with the other market research that I just suggested, and you can create some sort of a balance in there that's going to work for you, right? Based upon how long your lesson is going to be, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, 120 minutes, or something else. Okay. But you also want to be competitive. So you want to see what others are doing. And if it's going to be an in-person class, look at what folks, again, in your locality are charging. If it's an online class, look more broadly because it becomes a national and even an international sort of a marketplace or competition field at that point. And so you want to see what others are offering. And then also take a look at Reddit and other online discussion boards just to get an idea of what people are chatting about when it comes to this sort of education. Okay, so that's a quick overview. Hopefully that's helpful and will get you started down this path, and I wish you all the best. Thank you. And we have another question from Mark, who says, I'm new at cooking and inclined to get one all-purpose knife since I mostly eat veggies, fruits, lentils, beans, tofu, potatoes, and grains. Is a 5-inch Wüsthof Santoku chef's knife a good choice, or should I get a larger one? Okie doke. I'm going to first address some of the terminology that's used just for everybody in the audience here. Hopefully it'll offer a little bit of clarification. A Santoku is historically and traditionally, different from a chef's knife per se. So I want to tease these apart a little bit, although I understand that language changes over time, and it may well be that today, since more and more people are using a Santoku style knife, including some chefs, that some people might call it a chef's knife. But let me tease those apart a little bit. The Santoku is a Japanese style blade. It's got a very shallow curve on the blade. The top kind of curves down in toward the blade. And it's a fairly all-purpose knife. They tend to have a light gauge blade. So if you look at the blade from the top, it's fairly thin, which makes it really nice for less dense items. So most plant ingredients. The exception, could be, at least in my experience, things like dense winter squash, in which case it could be helpful to have a heavier gauge blade. I have seen blades chip when used on very hard and dense items. So do be aware of that. Now, if we shift our attention to what's called a chef's knife, that comes from the European tradition. And most of these, or at least originally, again, in my experience, they came from the European knife makers like Wüsthof and Henkel, and others from Germany and France. And they have a blade that curves a little bit up toward the end. The top is mostly flat, and you get this nice rocking motion, as you move across the cutting board, whenever that sort of movement is going to be needed. Um, so again, I just want to start out by kind of teasing those apart, because in my mind, they're two different styles of knife. Okay, but we'll focus on the santoku since Mark is mentioning that first anyway. So 5-inch blade. That means the cutting blade is 5 inches long, about this long, and then you've got the handle, which is probably going to be another 5 inches or so long. So let me also add that the selection of a knife is a very personal topic, or at least I think it should be. And ideally, you would go down to some sort of a cutlery store, or a Williams Sonoma sort of a kitchen place that has a cutlery section to give you a chance to hold these things, and to even pull out a cutting board the size that you would use at home, to get an idea of what that looks like and what it feels like. Okay. Keep in mind that the size of your blade is going to be directly correlated with the amount of food that you can prep in a given amount of time. The longer the blade, the more real estate it's going to cover on your cutting board, the more food you can chop, and the more you can prep in a given amount of time. So if you are prepping a relatively larger amount of food, then you're going to use a larger blade. If it's going to be a smaller quantity of food, then a smaller blade will be acceptable. This is why very often in restaurants where the prep volumes are relatively larger when compared to home cooking, you'll see cooks and chefs using, maybe an 8-inch blade as the smallest blade. And it'll go up from there. At 8 or 10 is pretty common. Anything bigger than that becomes less usual. Anything less than an 8-inch is a little bit less usual in a professional setting. At home, if you've got what's the size? About a 13 by 18-inch cutting board. A 8-inch chef's knife is about the biggest, or an 8-inch blade is about the biggest that you're going to comfortably use before the blade starts to overhang the edges of the cutting board. It becomes inconvenient. If you have a larger board, then great. You can cover more real estate, more ground with a larger blade without bumping into things or running out of cutting board. Your decision can also depend on the size of your hand. Although I'll also add a caveat by saying that I've seen plenty of professional cooks with smaller hands that just get used to, right, using a larger knife because you need to in a high volume setting. But a lot of folks that have smaller hands are just more comfortable using a shorter knife to start with. And at home, again, that's perfectly acceptable. So, I'll say that, at home, what comes to mind for me and, what I use I think interchangeably would be knives with a blade length of 6 to 8 inches most commonly. I would consider 5 inches to be a little bit short. But again, if you can get these knives in your hand to give it a try, that would be best. And at some of these cutlery stores, you can even bring some food product in to practice cutting to get a real feel for the knife. So that would be my recommendation if that's possible. If I had to just make a sort of a shoot from the hip recommendation for home cooking, I would say the santoku is a great choice. A chef's knife can work well. In other words, a European chef's knife, the santoku is a great choice. And something in the 6 to 7 inch, upwards of 8 inches, would be a good choice as well. But again, if you're getting into this anew, and you have, let's say, smaller quantities to prep, then maybe 6 or 7 inches would be quite adequate. All right. I hope that gives you a few points to think about, and yeah, have fun in the selection process. Thank you. All right. The next question is from Pam, who writes, my husband had a heart attack 11 years ago due to LPA gene. We follow Dr. Esselstyn's whole food plant-based plan. Any thoughts on getting enough protein when nuts and seeds are to be avoided? So the first thing that comes to mind for me, and this is certainly a pattern that I see globally as I've studied different eating patterns, and that is to focus on beans and legumes, that category of food products. It's a tremendous variation around the world. And, in that category of food, you're going to find that there's going to be a relatively high density of the amino acids that the body uses to build protein. And keep in mind that most of these beans, these legumes, are not complete proteins, on a singular basis. But as soon as you start to combine that with other ingredients in your meal, then that complementation takes place. The body is intelligent, and it takes care of the rest. But if we step back and look at cooking and eating from a broader perspective, this is also why it's desirable to eat a variety of foods so that we can enjoy the variety of amino acids or compositions that come into our body. So our body has all of the material to build the protein, as needed. And also keep in mind that, as we eat plant-based, that all of your foods offer amino acids that contribute to protein synthesis in the body. All of these foods, whether they're celery or carrots or legumes, have these amino acids in varying quantities. And again, this is where it's nice to eat a variety of foods, so the body and its intelligent way can build the protein that we need. But it's also nice to then focus on this bean and legume category of ingredients to enjoy the densely packed amino acids in these ingredients. And this is also why around the world, when we look at traditional diet patterns, they do include a focus on legumes, beans and legumes, and very commonly at each meal, so morning, noon, and night, in order to give the body the best chance at building the protein from the amino acids that you're bringing in through the diet. Okay. Now, beyond this very simple explanation, you might consider reaching out to a nutritionist or a dietitian and getting some direction, some advice from somebody that has some depth to their studies and their experience in this realm. Enjoy the process, and all the best to you, Pam. Thank you. Okay, next up, hello, Denise. The question is, does FOK, Forks Over Knives, have any advice on whether or not to use aluminum foil for cooking? Does the aluminum leach into the food when hot? I often cover an item with foil when reheating so it doesn't burn on the top, cottage pie, etc. Yeah, I don't recall off the top of my head what the Forks Over Knives course or the Forks Over Knives folks say in particular about foil, but I'll say that aluminum through foil use certainly has the opportunity, to leach into the food. And, this is made, even, well, maybe I should say this is hastened by high heat and a longer duration of contact, as well as if, in particular, acidic and what I recall is salty foods. If those are used in whatever it is that you're preparing, acids and salt, that'll hasten the process of drawing out any aluminum into the food itself. So, in terms of cooking, you know, I've read that 400 degrees or 450 degrees or so, is that sort of transition to maybe more of this aluminum, making contact and leaching into the food. So keep that in mind. A way to mitigate that is to cover whatever it is, the container you're using with parchment paper, and then put foil over that. You can also use plastic wrap if that works for you. Some people want to avoid plastic. That's why I mentioned that. But it's not uncommon in a commercial setting to put plastic wrap. It should be heavy duty plastic wrap, over a pan, and then foil over that. And then you can put that in the oven. And in the case of heavy duty plastic wrap anyway, it will withstand that environment with the protection of the aluminum foil. And then you don't have the contact of the aluminum foil. But parchment paper is an option. I've even heard folks, talk about wax paper. This would be in a home cooking sort of a setting. I don't use a whole lot of wax paper. It's usually parchment paper for me. And that's just a holdover from the professional cooking setting where parchment paper is, usually present in the kitchen. So, think about that, Denise. Maybe putting parchment paper down first, covering then with aluminum foil, and give it a test first to make sure that the aluminum foil will protect the parchment paper underneath in whatever temperature setting that you're cooking that or reheating that food product. Thank you. And the next question from Maria. What is the difference between taste and flavor? So taste is going to rely upon those few, senses that take place in the mouth. And, we have, let's see, there's the sense of sweet, the sensation, right, of sweetness. There's salt, there's sour, and there's bitter. And there's also umami. And then depending on, so that's what we deal with typically, let's say here in North America, in Japan, for example. But depending on what type of cooking you do, where you grew up, what part of the world you're affiliated with, you might also add to that list astringency, which is this pulling sensation. Think about biting into an underripe banana and that pulling sensation. That's astringency. We get that with green tea as another example. And then also heat from capsaicin, from chilies, is also considered a taste, in some cultures. Some people would argue that, oh no, it's not a taste sensation; it's a pain sensation. Well, yeah, I want to get maybe away from some of that splitting hairs sort of biological discussion and just kind of focus on the cultural, culinary, interpretation of taste, which does indeed include heat among some cultures, and there can be others as well, depending on what kind of cuisine or what culture you might be talking about. Now, flavor, on the other hand, is going to be the aroma of foods, aroma of things, kind of in conjunction with taste. And so flavor is going to be picked up through the nose, the olfactory sensory organ, the olfactory bulb. And those nuances number, in the many thousands. And, for example, if we uh, bite into a lime or a lemon, we might get sourness from each one. We could even get bitterness from each one, although probably the bitterness, degree is going to be noticeable. But they're going to have different aromas, different flavors. We're going to know that one's a lemon and one's a lime, even though those taste characteristics can be similar. Okay, and hopefully that helps. All right, so flavor sensitivity can be learned, and so through practice. And one sort of field of study that comes to mind is wine. And if you're studying to be a wine steward or a sommelier, then you spend a lot of time, drinking wine. That's part of the fun of the study, right? But also taking time to think about the smells, the aromas that you pick up in conjunction with the flavor, the taste and that whole flavor sensation on the palate and in the olfactory area. And you can start to discern between this red wine and that red wine, and a Pinot Noir produced in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, versus somewhere else. And all through these aromas that make up the flavor nuance of that particular food or beverage item. And when I was teaching cooking on ground, and as well as wine, I used an exercise where different items were placed into cups, like a raspberry and a vanilla bean and a lemon and a lime, and just a bunch of different things, maybe 15 or 20 samples. They were all covered with cheesecloth. These could be herbs as well, as tarragon and parsley and rosemary, and then have students smell each one and then write down what they think it is. And it's interesting because we rely quite a bit on our eyesight to discern the flavor of the food that we're eating. And when you take away the eyesight, then all of a sudden we can get confused, like, oh, this is a very familiar aroma, but I can't quite place it. And then when you show it to them, it's a raspberry. Of course, I knew that, is often the response. But you can train yourself then, like without the sight, right? I.e., drinking wine or tasting wine, you don't know what the flavor is by sight. You have to train your olfactory and brain connection to pick up these subtleties, these nuances. And so it's a fun exercise. It's a fun practice. You can maybe blindfold yourself when you're eating, have somebody bring a plate of food out, maybe put a bib on at that point, but you can then try to taste through some different foods and see, how you do, and further refine your sense of flavor when it comes to these various foods that you enjoy. Anyway, I hope that helps, Maria, and bon appetit. All right, moving on to Kathleen, who says, will you please talk more about the topic of miso? I am wanting to add more fermented foods and protein to my whole food plant-based diet. I am most interested in shelf stable versus refrigerated and quality ingredients. Okay. Miso should be stored in a cool environment, and it also needs to be kept clean. So in other words, no double dipping, no sticking your fingers into the miso. Any of these additional microbes, because there are already microbes in the miso, right? It's a living sort of organism. Any of these outside contaminants will start to have a negative effect, right, on the miso. It'll start to break down over time. And for folks that I've known that make miso at home, for example, it's not refrigerated. It's just kept, in a miso container. It's kind of like an earthenware pickling jar, and kept in a relatively cool place. And then it's going to be otherwise kept clean, during that period, weeks or so that you might use that batch of miso. Um, let's see. But most commonly, at least in the United States, I've seen folks refrigerate it. I buy store-bought miso, so I'm refrigerating it. It comes from the refrigerated section in the grocery store, and I just maintain that cold chain to home here. But otherwise, yeah, when it comes time to incorporating it into your diet, I just realized that I also put it on toast every once in a while. It's a very nice spread to use. And yeah, I encourage you to focus on quality ingredients. That's what it's all about, right? In the long run, you will benefit because your health will be better. 20, 40, 50 years from now, when it really counts to have good health. So I encourage you, Kathleen, to do all that you're able to do to accentuate the quality of the foods that you and your family enjoy. Thank you. And Amazing says, can you please share your breakfast miso recipe? Well, I'll talk about it. I don't have a recipe per se. Miso soup is based on stock, and Japanese stock is called dashi. And you can use whatever stock you want, but most commonly, you're going to find stock that's based on katsuobushi, which is dried bonito, which is a type of tuna, a relative of tuna anyway. I guess it's a type of tuna. It's dried and shaved into these little, very, very thin, wispy little shavings. And actually not always wispy. Sometimes it's kind of in flakes and chunks as well. But so you have traditionally a fish component, and the type of fish is actually variable too. It's not always bonito. And then kelp. And you can use both of those together, or you can use just one or the other. I will sometimes use them both together. If I am in a pinch of time, then I'll just use the kelp. And kelp, if you buy it at the store, it comes in these longer pieces. The pack sizes can vary. And I'll just break off a small piece and put that in the soup, enough for, let's say 3 people, something like that. It could be 4 or 5 portions. If there's leftover, then we eat that for lunch. But the kelp will expand by a few times. And so your little piece will end up being a piece like this. Once it gets pliable, I'll cut that into smaller pieces that are bite-sized and put it back into the soup and just eat that. A lot of recipes will say, simmer your kombu or your kelp and then discard it. Don't discard it. It's good food. Just cut it up and eat it. And so you got your dashi, and then whatever internal ingredients you want to put in there, do that. I will often use things like carrots and cabbage. It could be some sort of a choy, like bok choy, and it could be something else, a type of mushroom. This morning it was a what do you call them? A baby bella, I think they're sometimes called, those little brown mushrooms. And it could be shiitake, it could be anything in terms of mushrooms. And then other vegetables as well. And then I like to put tofu. That's that morning source of plant-based, protein. as we just discussed several minutes ago. And then you add your miso at the very end. So cook your vegetables, and you want to avoid boiling your miso, because that will just sort of neutralize any of the benefits that you might have from that living organism. Just put that in, and to taste, typically it's fairly light on the palate. I'm saying this within a European, or I should say an American flavor intensity context here. Aim for a relatively light or delicate flavored soup. And also keep in mind that miso can have a relatively high salt content. So if salt is a concern, and it really should be a concern for most of us, you can make a more robust flavored dashi and then cut back a little bit on the miso paste so that you still have an umami rich, satisfying soup for your breakfast. Okay, so hopefully that helps. Our soups are different every day, and hopefully you enjoy that variation as well. Thank you. All right, next up from Suzanne. Hello. Would Rouxbe, FOK, Forks Over Knives, consider an abbreviated or simplified baking course? I have read the curriculum for the course you offer. It's very in-depth. I'd just like to focus on whole grain yeast and sourdough breads and crackers, maybe a dessert pastry. Aha, it's a great question. It is certainly something we can consider, and I'm happy to take your suggestion, back to the team as we talk about these sorts of ideas, and we'll toss it around. Okay, and another consideration, I suppose, would be for you to take the existing course and just focus on the lessons that benefit you at this point, and perhaps you can. You might enjoy the additional content later on, or maybe you can bring family members in to enjoy the additional content in the course. Just a suggestion, but I'm happy to take your suggestion back to the committee, and we'll toss it around. Thank you. All right, another question from Elena, who says, besides Rouxbe, are there other online cooking schools, YouTube videos, or platforms that can turn a homemaker into a chef? So I don't know what other folks are doing, in terms of, online cooking schools. I'll leave that field work to you. In terms of YouTube, I've certainly seen a lot of videos on YouTube. I use YouTube myself from time to time. And what's on YouTube. There's millions and millions of videos and very interesting content as well. The challenge with using YouTube, and this is feedback from a number of our students and graduates now who have shared their experience starting out on YouTube before they came to Rouxbe, and that is that the content isn't curated at all, and there's no prescribed sequence. Our courses are created in a logical sequence that builds upon the previous content, and this is sort of experience that we bring from our pre-Rouxbe experience in many other culinary schools on ground around the country and the world where we have studied and taught. And so there's some rhyme and reason as educators, right, when we build a course as to its sequence. And so you don't get that when you surf YouTube. That's the big challenge if you're looking for that sort of structure. Otherwise, you can have fun and take a look at the varied content out there. Okay. I would also say that another difference that you're going to find, and a big difference, is that, at Rouxbe, we are a bunch of educators. We're chefs and we're educators. And so, we bring in a perspective of pedagogy, or some people would say andragogy, for the adult learner when it comes to building our courses. Whereas if you look at YouTube, you've got folks that are just capturing video of something and putting it up on the YouTube platform. And so there's not necessarily an educational approach, angle, explanation, and assessment to what it is that you're experiencing. All right. So a little insight there, a little overview, and hopefully that provides some satisfaction. Thank you. Next up is a question from Constance, who says, how can I bake salmon without a white substance appearing on the skin after baking? So the white substance is albumin, which is a protein that we all possess, just like the salmon. And the number one cause of the albumin coming to the surface is going to be a high temperature. And if you lower your temperature, and to start off with, I would say not more than 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and it could well be less than that, 340, 330, 325 degrees Fahrenheit, keeping in mind that you'll need to extend the cooking time, which is the premise here. It's a more gentle cooking experience for the fish, and that will mitigate some or all of the albumin that is being pushed out to the surface as the muscle fibers contract in the hot environment of the oven. Now, other things that people will do sometimes is to treat the salmon with brining. And that is to, soak it in a salt water solution. 5% salinity is pretty common. It could also be what's called a dry brine. You'll apply salt directly to the fillet, or however you cut that salmon. And salt starts to change the structure of protein, at least that protein on the surface that it can access. It's drawn into the muscle through osmosis. As it draws out moisture, salt is drawn in. As salt is drawn in, it starts to work on the protein molecules. It changes its structure. And by doing so, the result is less of the albumin that's released during cooking. So that's another addition to the food handling that some people will use. But the big one is going to be to mitigate the heat, dropping the temperature, extending the cooking time for a more gentle cooking environment. And you should be able to start to control that white substance that appears on the salmon. Thank you. Next up is from Sue. Hi, Sue. Do you have any suggestions for sauteing while working on a glass top oven? I get the temperature up to the mercury ball test and then have to drop it down quickly. Okay, this is a great question, but I'm going to take a little drink first. All right, this is green tea. What taste am I getting here? It's astringent. And what's the flavor? It's going to be green tea flavor. A little bit on the palate, or a little bit on the nose. But more on the palate in terms of flavor. All right. So back to Sue's question here in terms of working on a glass top, and maybe this doesn't really matter in terms of what the type of oven or cooktop you're using, but rather let's talk about the mercury ball test and sauteing. Okay. So the mercury ball test is, first of all, intended to be used a few times, right, as you learn to heat your pan on your range or your stovetop. And once you get to this point where you're comfortable, then you can sort of push aside that mercury ball test per se, and just start cooking, right, with a little more control. Okay, so that's the overview. So the mercury ball test is one where we ask you to use a stainless steel pan, put a little bit of water in there, just a little bead of water, and you will slowly heat the pan up. And as it goes through this range of temperature, the water will act in a different way. And it'll get to this point where, it just sits. It'll start out as just sort of sitting as a small puddle of water, as you can probably imagine if you just poured water into a pan. And it'll get to the point where that ball of water will roll around and bounce around like a ball of mercury, if you've ever seen that. Hopefully not played with it, not with bare hands anyway, but have seen that. And then it'll eventually get to the point when it's really hot, where the water goes in and it sort of explodes because there's so much heat and some steam is released, and these smaller little balls of water will bounce around. They might coalesce as they catch up with each other, but there's a little violent reaction, okay, to start with. So we're trying to find that sweet spot, okay, where the mercury ball stays intact and sort of does its thing, rolls around on that surface. And it works best with stainless steel cookware. If you're not using stainless steel, so Sue, bear with me here. I'm taking a little bit of a tangent. I'll come back around. If you're not using stainless steel, like in other words, anything else, you can do a similar test, but it's not going to look the same. Okay, so I'm going to get back to stainless steel here. While you're doing the mercury ball test, your goal, right, as the learning cook, is to pay attention to the heat that's being given off by the pan. And you're going to feel it with your hands, right? You're going to feel it on your face as that radiant heat comes up to you. And you're also going to observe what happens when you put food in the pan. So at these different stages of heating, you also want to add some food, whatever that is. It could be diced onion. I recommend something large, like large dice, maybe medium dice. Could be carrots, could be something else. Something with some sugar in it, like onions or carrots, is helpful because you can start to visually see the browning take place relatively quickly. Okay. And if the sugar content of the food is high, like onions, I think we recommend onions in our lesson, then you're also going to see at the top end when the pan gets too hot, because it'll burn pretty quickly. Okay. And so you want to start to connect these dots between your temperature dial, the temperature setting, the heat you're feeling, and visually what you're seeing on the food as it transforms. And then find that spot. It's not a spot, it's a temperature range with your cookware on your stovetop that works the best for sauteing. And also keep in mind that you will need to adjust that range based upon what it is that you're cooking to some extent. Okay. I suppose if you identify a comfortable range, you can just stay within that range and adjust it for the food item. Okay. So you're going to get to the point where you don't need to do the mercury ball test anymore. You'll be able to just feel and get some food in there. You'll use your hearing as well. Listen for the sizzle. Okay. Aroma. You'll use all your senses here, but primarily you want to start to feel the heat. And when it comes to the glass top, in terms of what's relevant here in this issue, as I revisit your question, Sue, is that I can think of is that, well, maybe there's a couple of things. A glass top range is going to be electric. So if you need to cool your pan down quickly, then simply pull the pan off of the heating element. That's going to be the quickest and safest thing to do. And I'll share a story with you. Okay, I've had the opportunity a few times in my professional career to cook on electric stovetops in restaurants. And these are going to be in places where the building code does not permit an open flame, right? So it's probably the insurance company, right, that's making these rules. But so you've got these, big fat electric coils, and the way that we would cook on them is because we don't have time, right, in a restaurant to wait for the electric coils to warm up. So you just turn them on high or something. You got a few 6 different uh, coils or cook places, and so you can set most of them on high and maybe a couple of them on a lower temp, and so you can start doing your saute work right away. The pan's going to heat up as quickly as it can without waiting for the coils to heat up. But if the pan gets too hot, then we can move it to a cooler setting, or we just pull the pan off. Okay. Now, also, when cooking on gas, this is going to be in a commercial setting where we have high BTUs. It could be at home too, right? That's where I'm going with this. If your pan gets too hot, just very simply pull it off the fire. And it's going to cool down as quickly as it reasonably can. Okay. Please do not immerse it in water. I have seen folks do that, and it will warp your pan. Now, the pan's not going to do this, but the surface will warp. And what I've seen it happen to is going to be stainless steel pans, like All-Clad or any of these other stainless steel pans that have multiple layers of construction, which is the way that the pans are made today. If they're shocked like that, then you're gonna permanently damage the pan. So don't cool it down that way. Just pull it off. The other thing to do is also, like simultaneously, if necessary, get more food into the pan, because that food is going to cool down the pan very quickly as well. So keep all that in mind, Sue, right, as you're doing your cooking, and everybody else too, if you face this situation. Okay. The other thing that I was thinking of with a glass top, cook range is that you might not want to toss your food, by flipping it, because if you hit the stovetop, that glass surface, you could crack it, right? So in which case, don't worry about flipping the food when you're sauteing. Just use a utensil, whatever's appropriate to move the food around or to flip it over, right? It could be chopsticks. It could be, a wooden spoon or whatever your choice is, so you don't risk damaging or prematurely scratching that surface as well. Okay. So again, a few things to think about. I hope this was helpful. Thank you. And next up is the final question for today. This is from Pam. How do I know what spices to use and how much to flavor foods well? So this is where 2 stages here. I'm going to work backwards. Obviously, practice is going to be a big part of this. But the first step, all right, is to go to a combination of spices that makes sense, which means take a look at global cuisine and what people in other parts of the world have been doing for thousands of years, okay? And you will start to understand what spices go together in a sensible way, all right? Also, you can study cookbooks of global cuisine and get an idea of what people enjoy in this part of the world or that part of the world, and then give it a try. And, you can start to, like take some really disparate areas and their spices or flavorings and combine them and see if they work out as harmoniously as the indigenous solutions. and then just move forward from that point. Okay. Um, Spices are used in ratios. That's going to be something to keep in mind. There's only, I shouldn't say there's only, there are only so many spices, but when you look at a given regional cuisine, there's going to be a subset. So, some really a smaller number of spices that are used, but they go into so many different dishes, and the dishes taste different. It's because all these spices are used in different ratios to bring out something more, right, from the cumin and coriander, for example, that goes well with this particular ingredient, right, or to bring forth something else um, that goes with a different ingredient. And also pay attention to how powdered spices are used versus the whole spice. Okay, powdered spices, right, have more surface area, so they're going to impart more flavor faster. They also burn easier, and compared to the whole spice. And so there's a couple things to think about in that realm too. Okay, and then practice, and then see how you like different spices. I always recommend that you taste spices on their own in their whole form, so you understand what that spice is lending to that dish when you're using it. That's going to give you a better ability to make adjustments down the road as all of this knowledge starts to come together. Okay, and then also be aware of the freshness of the spices. Keep in mind that spices um, are, it's a seasonal food, and most spices don't grow here in North America, where I'm based, where a lot of us are based, probably on this call. Um, so when I say seasonal, think about it on an annual basis. Okay, if you're buying cardamom and cumin and chilies and coriander and different things, try to replenish your stock on an annual basis if you happen to buy it in some larger quantity. If you can run through it in a shorter period of time, that's even better. Turn over your inventory in order to refresh it with a better quality product. The next thing is to think about where you buy your spices. And around here, when I buy spices, I will go to an Indian grocery store because you've got a pretty fast turnover of the spices, because you've got a bunch of Indians or other South Asians that are using this in their daily cooking, and so they need more of it pretty frequently. And so the shop is going to import more of it, and so their inventory is going to be relatively fresh compared to perhaps a mainstream, corporate grocery store that just doesn't move their product quite as fast. Okay. Um, then the other thing is, if you have a chance to travel, to Mexico to pick up vanilla beans and some cinnamon, or to India to get cloves and cardamom, bring in some spices when you travel. Then you're going to have arguably the freshest product on hand, and then enjoy it. Don't think, oh gosh, if I use this, I'm never going to get back to India. I don't want to run out. It's only going to get old and stale. So use it while it's fresh and enjoy it. Store it in an airtight container in a relatively cool place to maximize, the shelf life. Keep in mind that if you can smell that beautiful aroma of your spices, the spices are losing their flavor. All right. So enjoy it by getting it into your food and your beverages, and consume it every day. Also put spices into every meal of the day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, as well as your snacks if you can. Spices have so many phytonutrients that are beneficial for our body. And in some cases, we don't even know, I should say in a lot of cases, we don't even know the full benefits of the spices, because they haven't been studied to that extent yet. And we don't, even if we knew what was in it, we wouldn't necessarily know the beneficial effect of the phytonutrients on our bodies. So don't wait for the researchers to do all their homework in their labs. Instead, just enjoy the flavor, aromatic, and health benefits of spices by getting it into all of your food and beverage at every meal of the day. And when in doubt, add turmeric. Thank you very much. That brings to conclusion today's program, and I want to thank you all for your participation today, and I'll look forward to you again at my next office hours. In the meantime, happy cooking.